The statistics on death are quite impressive, observed George Bernard Shaw. 1 out of 1 person dies. To be sure, many of us have lost loved ones. Some of us fathers we wish we could talk to again. Some mothers we wish we could feel their arms around us. Some sisters, perhaps, that we've shared so much with. Even some mates and children from which we've never fully recovered. For me, it's my mom and dad. Even though I never got along with my father, I couldn't help feel a little orphaned when they both passed away. My father died in 2008 and my mother in 2017. To be honest with you, I felt strangely alone in the world. We all know that loss certainly includes loved ones, but loss isn't limited to death. Sometimes it's just saying goodbye causes loss, like seeing your children leave home. In my case, it was our son who was being deployed in Iraq for 3 separate tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, for which he has never recovered emotionally from. Sometimes it's the loss of a relationship through divorce. That causes unbearable pain and stress. See, divorce is like a death, because the person's still walking around. Sometimes it's just loss of wealth, a job, a home. Sometimes it happens in a church like Grace United. As we know, as I had observed this past couple of months, we've gone through a lot of loss. Even Steve, who is now making plans to fly to be with his mother, who the doctors have given 2 weeks to live. I read the prayer requests on Facebook page and feel the pain and loss and helplessness that many of us are going through. And thus we join the company of the walking wounded. But you know what I found? Christians seldom sing in a minor key. We fear the somber. We hold sorrow in low esteem. How many times have you heard a well-meaning person encourage a struggling believer, perhaps yourself, by saying, it doesn't help to get upset. You simply need to trust God. Of course, the idea here is that if you trust God and love and obey God, there's no need to feel loss or experience sorrow. See, we fail to see that doubt, loss, and lament are the dark soil which is necessary to grow confidence and joy. We fail to see that lament is often a pathway back to God. Winston Marsalis says that the blues are a vaccination against the real disease. I like that. A bit of the disease prevents the sickness of complete loss and despair. Dan Allender, whose book I recommend on Lament, said to sing a lament against God in worship reveals far, far greater trust than to sing a jingle about how happy we are and how much we trust God. That kind of song is so much like a smiling salesman who meets you and says, hey, how you doing? You're looking good today. How can I help you? Lament cuts through insincerity. It strips pretense. It reveals the raw nerve of trust that angrily sometimes approaches the throne of grace and then kneels in awed, robust wonder. Unquote. Are you experiencing loss today? If you are, how do you navigate through those storms of loss in your life? What can loss teach us? Asaph in Psalm 77 writes a lament in the midst of his loss and despair in order to help us. He gives us three things that can help us navigate our way through the losses in our life. Now, in order to save time, I'm not going to read the psalm up front. I'll read it as I expound it. I'm using the NIV, and I'm transliterating the names of God in this psalm, and there's a lot of them. And the idea of the names of God, and when the psalmist used these things, it's like a multifaceted diamond of the character of God, and he's appealing to certain aspects of the character of God as it's revealed in his names. I'll also explain the Hebrew words in more detail because, to be frank with you, the English translations are often too bland and flat. My purpose in doing so is that you and I might enter more vividly into Asaph's experience of what is going on in his life. Now, we don't know the circumstances of this psalm, all of them, but the themes of loss and despair are woven throughout the psalm, so much so that you cannot ignore them. So Asaph cries in three ways. In verses 1 to 6, he cries in lament. Then verses 7 to 10, he cries in his doubts. And in verses 11 to 20, he cries out in his comfort and his trust in God. So the first 6 verses tell us that we can get through times of loss by crying out to God. Sometimes, though, in our crying out to God, we often find that there is no comfort in our persistent prayer toward him. And that's what the first 2 verses talk about. I cried to Elohim for help. I cried out to Elohim to hear me. I was in distress. I sought Adonai. At night, I outstretched my untiring hands, and I would not be comforted. Now, he uses the word hear me. He's not asking God to listen to him. He's actually asking God to deliver him. And it refers to God as with the name Elohim. Elohim is the all-powerful God of creation. And he's saying that I know that you are all-powerful, and therefore you can deliver me from this loss. And if you are the God of creation, you can certainly deal with my circumstances. Now in verse 2, he describes how he cried. He says, it was in my distress, he says. We're not sure quite what the distress was. Maybe it was a loss, a death, or some kind of a circumstance that caused incredible pain for him. Now notice he addresses God in a different name. He uses the word Adonai, which is used exclusively of God, and it points to God's ownership, God's mastery and ownership of the entire universe, and also mankind and our individual lives. And he's saying that if you are the master of the universe, and so that you know what my distress is, then I'm going to pursue you for deliverance. And he says, at night, I stretched out my untiring hands. He's probably making a reference to Moses. You remember Moses in Exodus 17, where he put his hands up and they were winning the battle, and he got tired and he put his hands down and they lost the battle, and finally 2 guys come around and they hold up his hands. And he's saying, my hands didn't grow numb like Moses did. Asaph did this, though, at night. At night. In a time when there are no lights, the night often brings loss closer, doesn't it? Often it's in the dark that we feel the need for help as the darkness closes in on us. And the word I here, once again, it's just sort of in English, it's just I. But in Hebrew, he uses the word my soul, my life. My life, he says, refused to be comforted. He found no relief. The phrase refused to be comforted is used of Jacob when he was told of Joseph's death. He refused to be comforted. Now, can you imagine that kind of loss? That's how Asaph feels, like he lost a beloved child. And he says, I can't deal with it. So stop trying to comfort me. Some of you feel that way. Perhaps you haven't lost a child, but some of you feel a lot of loss in your life. And you need to cry out to God about it. We need to lament. The first thing we need to do in navigating the storms of loss is to lament, to cry out to God in our pain and our loss. But Asaph really found no comfort in his lament. Why didn't he find any comfort? Verse 3 to 6 tells us, I remembered you, Elohim, and I groaned. I meditated. My spirit grew faint. Selah. You kept my eyes from closing. I was too troubled to speak. I thought about the former days, the years of long ago. I remembered my songs in the night. Often we cannot reconcile our problems with the character of God, can we? Asaph remembers the great Elohim. If he's so powerful, then why am I so empty? I can't understand my loss in light of his greatness. I just can't. He says he groaned. It's used of the waves of the sea. The emphasis seems to be on the agitation and confusion within Asaph's mind that leads him to be disturbed and unsettled. It's like he's tossed by the ocean waves of loss. And he says he meditated. He grew faint. He was overwhelmed. He was like a walking wounded man. That's how the word is used. So here he was. He's like a wounded soldier in battle, walking through the desert. So often we can't square our problems with God, with the God who we know, the God who we love and we walk with every day. It just doesn't work. It doesn't fit. Then he uses the term Selah. Well, they don't know quite what the meaning of the word is, but it's probably a meditative pause where he says, take what I just said in. Take it in. The fact that you can't reconcile the issues sometimes in your life with what you know about God. Now, what are the effects of this loss in his life? Verse 4. You kept my eyes from closing. I was too troubled to speak. In our confusion and loss, we lose sleep and even speech. You've kept my eyes open. Yes, loss can pin your eyes open in insomnia. Notice he blames God for this. You kept my eyes open. The verbal idea here is that you did this all the time for me. You continually kept me from sleeping. Can you relate to that? That going through a loss in your life, you just can't sleep. You toss and turn all night. And he says, I was too troubled to speak. The word troubled is used of a hammer that pounds on an anvil. And loss is like a pounding of a hammer to the point where you cannot speak. My best friend lost his wife many years ago. He called her the love of his life. And he told me that for days after she died, he couldn't speak. He couldn't talk. He had to go to a counselor to get him to speak again. Why was Asaph affected this way? It says in verse 5, I thought about the former days, the years of long ago. I remembered my songs in the night. My heart meditated and my spirit asked. Even remembering sometimes God's faithfulness can bring no relief and from our despair. He uses the term former days, probably referring to Israel's history. It seems to me to be more of a general remembrance, not a very specific one. And then he says about his songs, the word for songs here is the word that's used of a musical instrument that a song is played on. And music has that effect, doesn't it? That brings up the past to us, doesn't it? When you hear a song that you've long forgotten and suddenly you remember where you were and what you were doing when that song plays. But those songs were his songs. They were his perspectives. And as we shall see, not necessarily God's perspective. The second part of the verse says he meditated, his spirit asked, his heart mused and talked. His spirit inquired. The idea is that he deeply scrutinized every aspect of his memory, not understanding why it wasn't helping him. But his searching and scrutinizing was in the wrong place. It was in himself. He now turns inward. He says, I thought, I remembered, I meditated. The spirit intensely searched. The anger and loss turned inward leads to depression and deep doubt. Have you ever been there? You ever been in deep doubt and depression over something that's happened in your life that caused incredible loss for you? Sometimes our prayers seem to hit the ceiling, don't they? And they just come flat down on the floor. And that can lead you down. C.S. Lewis said that unanswered prayer is like going up to God's house and knocking on the door and hearing the bolts latch and the lights go out. And you look up, nobody's home. Remember when we were kids and we went out to trick-or-treating on a cold October night? You know, and you come to a house and it's dark and it's black and all the lights are out, and you know that you're not going to even knock on the door because you know that nobody's there. That's what unanswered prayer is like. But we often are afraid to tell God how we feel. Why? Why are we afraid to do that? Because we don't trust Him. See, we think somehow that lament is a sign of lack of trust. Nothing could be further from the truth. Lament is the dark soil of growth upon which the storms of life rain. And some of you need to cry out to God today in the midst of your loss. Jesus himself cried out with loud cries and tears. Hebrews 5:7. May I say that the cry of lament could be the first step in navigating yourself through loss. Now, what Asaph does here, he turns inward, which leads to doubts. And this leads to the second principle, which I think can help us navigate times of loss. That is, expressing our doubts to God. The first principle is to cry out to God in lament. And now in verse 7 to 9, he asks 6 questions of doubt. First one in verse 7, will Adonai reject forever? Will he never show his favor again? In times of loss and inward depression, we often fear that God has rejected us. The implication of verse 7 is that, will the master and owner of the universe and my life, Adonai, will he reject me? After all, he is Adonai. He won't reject me, will he? Then he states it even more negatively. Will he never show his favor again? Will he never be pleased with me again? And the word forever in the original text is thrown in the front of the verse, emphasizing and stressing the emphatic thought that God has forgotten him forever. Note that he's blaming himself, but he's also doubting God. And in times of loss, we often blame ourselves, don't we? You know, if God has rejected me, if God has refused his grace to me, I must have done something wrong. If God is the master of the universe, then it must be my fault. It must be something that I've done wrong. And his doubts continue in verse 8. Has his unfailing love vanished forever? Has his promise failed for all time? We even doubt God's loyalty and his faithfulness to us and when we're going through loss. The word for unfailing love is the word chesed. It's the covenant-keeping, loyal love of God. It is the hallmark of his relationship to us. And he's asked, has it vanished toward me? Has his promise failed for all time? Literally, his speech. Has what he said failed? He starts to doubt God's promises to him. Maybe God really isn't faithful. Maybe what he has, or what he says has failed me. Then in verse 9 he says, has El, different name for God, El forgotten to be merciful? Has he in anger withheld his compassion? You see, we often despair that God will never be gracious and compassionate towards us ever again. Note the new name that he introduces, El. It refers to the greatness of God above all the other gods of the pantheon of the ancient Near East. The difference between Elohim and El is that El refers to that God is the source of all power. And Elohim is the display of that power in the world. And he's saying that perhaps in his greatness above all other beings and all other things in the universe, he has stopped to be gracious, he has forgotten to be gracious to me. And he says, he adds, in his anger, literally his face shows that he has withheld compassion and anger toward Asaph. Notice the guilt underlying forgotten, angry. If only maybe I did something different. If only I didn't travel in that direction. And if I left just a little bit earlier, the tragedy wouldn't have happened. If I only took better care of myself, if I only didn't fail so terribly, if I only spent more time with them, if I only could have said what they really meant to me. This loss has happened in my life because I did something wrong. And God has forgotten to be merciful to me. He has withheld his compassion. Maybe God, if I responded differently, if I acted better, you would have acted differently. And he closes with the word, Selah. Take that. Verse 10, and then I thought, to this I will appeal. It concludes that God's character has changed. The word for appeal here is the idea to be grieved to the point of being sick to your stomach. And he thought that if God has changed, that thought makes him sick to his stomach. Then the next line, a very, very strange line in the psalm. The years when El Elyon stretched out his hand. Now what in the world does that mean? Well, there's a technical problem here with the word years. Pardon me for being a little technical, but in Hebrew the word is shenot. But there's a verb with the same letter that means change. It's like a homonym. Now we say the word trunk. It could refer to an elephant trunk. It could be a trunk of your car. It's a homonym that has spelled the same but has two different meanings. So I think the New American Standard is correct here when he says the right hand of El Elyon has changed. Asaph is saying, maybe, just maybe, Elyon has changed toward me. Maybe this is the reason God has withheld his mercy and compassion to me. And now he uses another name, Elyon, the Most High, the infinitely supreme God. The phrase is used of stacking baskets, and the top basket is called Elyon. And he's saying that, can the greatest and highest of all beings be subject to changing his mind? Is that possible? I'm beginning to think so. In times of loss, have you ever doubted God? Well, let me ask you this. Do you think doubt is bad? John the Baptist doubted. Jesus called him the greatest of all men. But he doubted. Maybe doubt isn't always bad. So taking this further, what's the opposite of faith? It's not doubt. It's unbelief. So doubt is the bridge between trust and unbelief. It's the bridge, it's doubt. Now, doubt can swing you to unbelief. Or doubt can also swing you back to God. In Asaph's case, we'll see that it swings him to greater trust in Yahweh. But Asaph never got his 6 questions answered. Neither do we, do we? We very rarely get an answer to our questions of loss in our life. Now, it's very natural to ask those questions, right? Why, God? Why did you let this happen to me or to them? How can you let this go on? But I like what Rainer Maria Rilke said to a young poet. He said, I beg you, he says, to have patience with everything unresolved in your heart, and to try to love the questions themselves as if they were locked rooms or books written in a very foreign language. Don't search for the answers, which could not be given to you now, because you would not be able to live them. Live with the questions. Perhaps then, someday, far in the future, you will gradually, without even noticing it, live your way to the answer. But Jesus is the answer, right? In one sense, he is. He is the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. But I think we often use him as a spiritual bypass to avoid the questions and doubts that we have. We just use a platitude, but we fail to really deal with the issues that we have. And sometimes I think we don't really even know what the questions are. Asaph was bold enough to ask the questions to God. And we need to ask those questions as well, that what we deal with. We need to ask the questions first. Have you ever thought that the reason that you are not told the answers to your problems and losses, or perhaps another person's problems and losses, because you couldn't bear it? Maybe unanswered questions are actually a display of God's grace to us. Because we couldn't bear it, or worse, we could not accept it. Don't settle for unquestioned answers, but be intrigued by the unanswered questions of our lives. It can draw you closer to God. They can swing you from doubt to awe and trust. So what are your questions? What are the questions of your loss? Do they push you away from God? Then be honest with God about it. And don't live in Egypt by a river called denial. Or does the mystery of God draw you closer in awe and wonder? See, the first step in navigating through storms of loss is to cry out to God. The second is to express our doubts to God. And the third is to lay hold of God himself. Verses 11 through 20. The first way we lay hold of God is by intensely considering his wondrous dealings with us in the past. Verse 11. I will remember the deeds of Yahweh. Yes, I will remember your miracles of long ago. I will consider all your works and meditate on all your mighty deeds. After his doubts, after his crying out, Asaph begins to lay hold of God. Could it be that in order to better lay hold of God, that we need to go through those tears and through those doubts that we experience? Notice the determined focus. He says, I will remember. He says it twice. And he says, I will consider. I will meditate. All terms of intense contemplation. Not a vague remembrance of Israel's history, as he did earlier. I will remember the deeds of Yahweh, the covenant-keeping God, the self-existent one who is uncaused, underived, and transcendent and yet personal. Yahweh told Moses that he heard the cries of his people in Exodus chapter 3. And Yahweh was the one that led them out of Israel. Your miracles, your works, your mighty deeds. Notice now, Asaph is now addressing Yahweh personally. He's moved from the third person to the second person, and he's getting very, very personal with God. Your mighty deeds, referring to the totality of his works. When we remember his works, we can begin to lay hold of God himself. And now he moves from his mighty deeds to his character. Notice what he says about God, verse 13. Your ways, Elohim, are holy. What God is as great as our Elohim? The second way we truly lay hold of God is by intimately knowing God's character. He gives us 5 aspects of this character. We lay hold of him by knowing that he is perfect and without peer. The word holy means that he is the most unique person in the entire universe. It refers to his otherness. Note the change, by the way. In the first part of the psalm, Asaph tries to conform God into his own image. He tries to tell God what he's doing in his life. But now he realizes that God's ways are not his ways. Elohim's character is set apart. He is unique. His holiness is not connected to human understanding. Maybe laying hold of God means that we need to realize that he has laid hold of us in ways that we can never really conceive. His lament has led him to extol God's character. Verse 14, you are El, who perform miracles. You display your power among people. We lay hold of God by remembering his great works in our past. And when we see it in our past, it advertises his strength not only to us, but also to other believers. Remember the faithfulness of God, El, far above other gods, in your life motivates trust in the midst of loss, but not only for you, but also for everyone else. Verse 15, with your mighty arm you redeemed your people, the descendants of Jacob and Joseph. Selah. We lay hold of God by seeing him as our kinsman redeemer, purchasing us by his raw power. This is the term, his mighty arm. It's symbolic, a symbol of his power to deliver in adversity. And when a man sold himself into slavery, it was up to his kinsman redeemer to buy him back. And God is his kinsman redeemer, and the one who has purchased Israel and us out of loss and despair. Asaph refers to his people as descendants, as descending from Jacob and Joseph. I'm not sure why he picked those two, but perhaps because these guys know what suffering and loss is. And the nation has descended from them. And we are spiritually descended from them. And it's as if he's saying, if you want to see the power of redemption at work, look at Jacob. Look at Joseph. Selah. Take that in. Now, Asaph describes a Red Sea experience, but he mixes in a thunderstorm with this. Perhaps it's the thunderstorm that brings to mind God's power in the Red Sea. And I'm just going to read this, verses 16 to 19. I want this to wash over you, no pun intended. Just listen to how he extols the mighty power of God as he remembers him. The waters saw you, Elohim. The waters saw you and writhed. The depths were convulsed. The clouds poured down water. The heavens resounded with thunder. Your arrows flashed back and forth. Your thunder was heard in the whirlwind. Your lightning lit up the world. The earth trembled and quaked. Your path led through the sea, your way through the mighty waters, though your footprints were not seen. And in verse 20, we see the final, fifth way to lay hold of God is by seeing him leading us like a shepherd. Only God leads us in paths that will eventually benefit our lives. You led your people like a flock, like by the hand of Moses and Aaron. He now picks up where he left off in verse 15. God leads the way, even though we do not see his footprints. Think of what that means. He leads the way in loss, in our suffering, and in our despair. That means that the shepherd experiences despair and heartache of loss first, and he leads us. Jesus Christ leads us today, or will lead you through some very dark valleys and shadows of death experiences, as we have seen in our own church. But we need not fear evil, for he is with us. If you fear darkness, fear the future, know that he has been there before you. And he can navigate you through it. Don Hollander says, the cry of lament is never answered. It is confessed. God does not rationalize. God does not stoop to answer. He responds by wailing with us. He cries out through his Son, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani? My God, why have you forsaken me? It's on the cross where we see the Son of God in loss, in abandonment, in fear of death. He, as the great shepherd of the sheep, has blazed a trail of blood, a pathway of the Villa Dolorosa of our souls. Often, lament softens the hardness of false piety or arrogant unbelief and intensifies our search. It puts us before the face of Jesus' inconceivable cry. As the great prophet Isaiah said, quote, so he became their Savior. In all their troubles, he was troubled too. He didn't send someone else to help them. He did it himself, in person. Out of his own love and piety, he redeemed them. He rescued them and carried them along for a long, long time. Isaiah 63, verse 9. See, we navigate through times of loss by acknowledging our pain, and our doubts, and by acknowledging what God has done and who God is in his character. So to take away this morning, I want to talk about three things in closing to re-emphasize these very important points to help us navigate through storms of loss. The first one is cry out to God. As Don Hollander says, crying out to God is not an end in itself. There should be no question that God does not want us to sing lament as a staple of our worship, nor should it be the internal hymn of our choice. But lament opens the heart to wrestle with God, who knows that sorrow leads to comfort. And lament moves to praise as sure as the crucifixion gives way to resurrection. Number two, build remembrances of God's faithfulness. Make Ebenezer's in your life. Not Ebenezer Scrooges, but Ebenezer's. They were called that because they were cairns of remembrances. They were monuments to his faithfulness. And Israel often did this. And so when they traveled by these things, they would remember that God met them there. God was faithful to them there. And we need to be specific around that. I don't know about you, but sometimes his faithfulness slips through my fingers. Yeah, he's been faithful to me. Well, and then we forget about it. But maybe what we need to do is, maybe it's a stone that we find, where we follow that God met us in a certain significant way. He came through us in a place. And here's a stone of where that happened. Just put it on your desk. Maybe it's a song that speaks of God's faithfulness to you. And you need to go back and listen to that again. Maybe it's a photograph that brings back a time of God's presence in your life. See, these are tools to help us remember who God is in those tough times. See, God's past faithfulness to you is the basis of his future and present faithfulness for you. Where is God in your loss? He's right next to you. Number three, lay hold of God himself, because sometimes, brothers and sisters, that's all you got. Now, we do that by knowing him in the midst of loss. When there doesn't seem to be deliverance, there's often a realization in our hearts and in our souls. When we stop making God in our image and truly lay hold of who he is and what he has done. And we need to do this with each other. We need to allow people in our church, in our life group, to lament, to feel bad, to even doubt, without trying to fix them. Otherwise, we might be doing spiritual bypasses on people, shouting or stating spiritual platitudes that have no meaning. Ken Medina wrote a song. This is what I close with. He says, if this is not a place where my tears are understood, then where can I go to cry? If this is not a place where my spirit can take wing, then where can I go to fly? I don't need another place for trying to impress you with how good and virtuous I am. I don't need another place for always being on top of things. Everybody knows it's just a sham. I don't need another place for always wearing smiles, even when it's not what I feel. I don't need another place to mouth the same old platitudes, because you and I both know it's not real. If this is not a place where my questions can be asked, then where else should I go to seek? If this is not a place where my heart cries can be heard, then where shall I go to speak?